I turn to Hosea chapter 4. As you know, we've been working through this series of Hosea. And then next, I think someone has asked me to do 2 Thessalonians. But we still have a period of time before we get there. Hosea chapter 4. Now last time, we got down to about verse 5 or 6 here. So let's think about what we talked about. Last time we looked at the relationship between truth and knowledge and mercy. The idea was that if you rejected the truth of God, then you would also lose along with that the knowledge of God. And you would also lose along with that the mercy of your own nature toward others when you are being like God. So we know that there's this relationship between truth and knowledge and mercy. God started this section with the priests. And he was talking about the priests. We discovered because the priests rejected biblical truth, that the people followed along with them. So part of the problem was the priests. Now we also talked about the fact, and we mentioned it a couple of times, that what they did was they substituted the worship of Jehovah God with the worship of some golden calves. Now, what had happened in Israel when this took place was that they continued to use the name Jehovah or Yahweh or whatever you wish here to represent these two calves. So they were calling these two calves Jehovah. Okay? Look, O Israel, these are your gods, in essence. And so we had this false worship going on, and this false worship was a rejection of God and His truth. Now, we noted last time that God began the discussion of this controversy with the people of Israel by aiming his first complaint at these priests, at the priesthood. He did so because the people were being led into error by these priests. The passage we will look at today expands on the idea that lost truth also leads to lost knowledge. So knowledge will kind of be the focus of what we will look at today. The passage today focuses on the process of the rejection of God by the priest and the people, and they've rejected God as the source of their knowledge and truth. And this leads to the ultimate degeneration of the people and the priests into false worship because of their decision to reject God as the source of knowledge. The focus of the teaching of this portion of Hosea is that as the result of their rejection of God, of the knowledge of God, they had disastrous results. Okay, that's the whole focus of the section. Now let's look first at verses 6 through 11. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me. Seeing thou hast forgotten the law of God, I will also forget thy children. As they were increased, so they sinned against me. Therefore will I change their glory into shame. They eat up the sin of my people, and they set their heart on iniquity. And there shall be like people, like priests, and I will punish them for their ways, and reward them for their doings. For they shall eat and not have enough. They shall commit whoredom, and they shall not increase, because they have left off to take heed to the Lord. So, the first point here is that knowledge, the rejection of knowledge, the knowledge of God, will erode away in your life. When you reject the knowledge of God, the knowledge you have will erode away. Now, there are several things that the knowledge, the rejection of God causes, and we're going to look at some of those results under that. The rejection of knowledge, the knowledge of God, causes the destruction of the people. The term here for destruction in verse 6 can mean that they cease to exist, that they were destroyed, that they were cut off. My people are destroyed because they lack or are without knowledge. And the reason that they were without knowledge is because they rejected the knowledge of God. Now, the second thing under this first point is that the source of all knowledge is the knowledge of God. Let's not forget that. That's important. I go to school and I learn things, right? I learn that the earth is round and, there's stars up there and all of these things. I learn that rivers flow, right? But they always seem to flow from one point to another. They don't just randomly flow wherever they want to. They flow by specific rules. The earth that's round, I found out, or it's not really round, it's kind of egg-shaped. But that egg-shaped earth spins around at a certain speed. Right? It spins around at a certain speed. It's almost 24 hours, or it's about 24 hours. Close to 24 hours. And it tilts at certain times toward the sun. The top tilts toward the sun. Sometimes the bottom tilts toward the sun. And that's what causes our seasons. And that other object out there that spins around, called the moon, that spins around the earth, kind of determines when we separate months. At least that's the way they used to determine it, by the lunar calendar. So, everything, though, happens in a certain order, and that order is determined by laws. Now, they might be physical laws, but you know what? Somebody had to put those laws into place, or the world would be chaos. Law depends on a lawgiver. So even physical knowledge, the physical knowledge that we learn, the true physical knowledge, is based on the fact that there is a God in the heavens. And therefore, when I reject the knowledge of God, in essence, I start to lose all knowledge. Now, especially in the area of morality. Paul says at one point, when he's talking about the law, that the law is holy, just, and good, And the reason he says this is that he would not know that it was wrong to do certain things unless the law told him that they were wrong. Okay? So it's the knowledge of God, and when you reject Him as the source of your knowledge, you are in essence rejecting knowledge in total. Now in Proverbs 1:7, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. It is not only the source of all knowledge, it is the beginning place of all knowledge." And the knowledge of God should give us a respectful fear and awe of the great God of the universe. Human life on this planet is determined on this egg-shaped ball spinning around at a certain speed, at being a certain distance from the sun, of rotating around that sun at a certain speed, of being the exact distance it needs to be, with the moon, the exact distance it is. If these things were not true, if the earth wasn't the way it is, by the laws that it is, human life would not be possible here. Now, we ought to have an awesome respect for the God who rolled out the universe and set those things in order. And when we lose the knowledge of God because we've rejected Him, we lose that awesome respect for God, and we cause ourselves problems. All right, now the rejection of God, or the rejection of the knowledge of the Lord, is based on the rejection of the moral law. Again, we look at verse 6. The reason Israel rejected the knowledge of God is because they had rejected the law of God. Now, if they looked at the law of God, they would have known they shouldn't have been worshiping up in Samaria in the first place. Okay? And if they had looked at the law of God, they would have known that God wanted, the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, not 2 golden calves. Okay? God wanted things done in a certain way. And they didn't want to do that, so they did something else. And said, oh, this is equal to what God told me to do. I'm just going to do this over here. I just want to do this. I don't care what God says. I'm going to do this. So they rejected the moral law of God. Okay? They rejected the concept that sin is wrong. They called something else sin. They rejected the ideas that they should meet on certain days, at certain places, at certain times, because God told them to. And because their actions weren't the way they wanted it to be, they started to take compromise in other areas. The word whoredom is not used in this passage just as a concept or an idea. And we'll get to that later in today's lesson. But what I want you to understand is this society was wrapped up in sin. Wrapped up in sin. It consumed them. That's the next sub-point here. The results of of the rejection of God on the moral character of the people were these. First of all, it caused, according to verses 7 and 8, an increase in sinful action. You reject the knowledge of God, all of a sudden, you're out there doing more that you shouldn't be doing. Okay? God's not my source. I don't care. I'm going to choose for myself what's right, what's wrong. Sin increases. The rejection of God, the knowledge of God, causes the rejection by God of you as His people. You know, you find someone who's deviated from the path, that's gone, I guess they call that backsliding, right? They've backslidden. They've gone back to their old life. They say, oh, I'm just not feeling the blessings of the Lord. The Lord isn't with me. That's because He's not. He's not in that situation out there. Now, God might be calling you back to where He is. Okay? But God isn't blessing you out there in the midst of that cesspool you put yourself in. You go to Mesquite, Arizona, you start pumping money into the slot machines. I didn't do that, but other people, I watched them do that while I was there. You spend all your money and paychecks and all of that stuff to gamble. And you pray to yourself, you pray to God, you know, you're down to your last 20 and you're sliding into the machine and you're saying, God, I need your blessing here. Well, don't expect the coin slot to fill up. It doesn't do that anymore anyway. They give you a ticket. But don't expect the little red light to go on, the bells to happen, and the whistles, and you know, people to come and pat you on the back and take your picture and stick it on the casino, because it's not going to happen. You get yourself in trouble at school or work because of your stupidity and sinful actions. Don't expect God to take you and bless you despite the fact that you've done something wrong. Somebody was telling me a while back there was this female prisoner on death row in the state of Texas. It's a famous case. I don't need to say the lady's name here. She was on death row, and somebody said she's become a Christian. And I said, that's great. That'll help her in the next life, because she's going there pretty quickly. Because the sin in this world is going to kill her. Don't expect God to take you out of your mess if you're not willing to continue to follow Him. If you're not willing to acknowledge Him, if you're not willing to straighten your life out. The rejection of the knowledge of God on the moral character also includes this concept of shame in these two verses. It causes shame. The word for shame here means shame, disgrace, dishonor. You ought to be ashamed when you reject God. The sinful nature consumes the person who has rejected God. Some people get themselves into things they can't extract themselves from. They get themselves in situations they can't get out of. They tell a lie and they have to tell more lies to cover it up. And lying's better than telling the truth at some point. they drift off into this and it becomes their habit, their lifestyle. And it gets to be very hard to extract themselves from it. Sin's addictive. It's the way it is. It eats you up. It consumes you. It destroys you. Yeah, it could be pleasurable for the season, right? Sort of like it could have been pleasurable for Moses. You know, he didn't suffer the pleasures or the pleasures of sin for a season. But the ultimate result of sin is death. And it will consume you. Now, also along with the results of the rejection of the moral character, the degradation of character causes the heart of the person who has rejected the knowledge of God to stray even further from God. All right, let's look at the second major point in today's lesson. So we're going to look at some more verses here. Let's first of all look at Hosea chapter 4, verses 12 down through the end of the chapter. Hosea chapter 4. My people ask counsel at their stocks, and their staff declareth unto them, for the spirit of whoredoms has caused them to err, and they have gone a whoring from under their God. They sacrifice on the tops of mountains, and they burn incense upon the hills, under the oaks and the poplars and the elms, because the shadow thereof is good. Therefore your daughters shall commit whoredom, and your spouses shall commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they commit whoredom, nor your spouses when they commit adultery, for they for themselves are separated with the whores, and they sacrifice with the harlots. Therefore the people that doth not understand shall fall. Though thou, Israel, play the harlot, let not Judah offend, and come not ye unto Gilgal, nor go ye up to Bethaven, nor swear, the Lord liveth. For Israel slideth back as a backsliding heifer. Now the Lord will feed them as a lamb in a large place. Ephraim is joined to idols. Let him alone. Their drink is sour. They have committed whoredom continually. Her rulers with shame do love give ye. The wind hath bound her up in her wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. Now let's take a look at some other results, if you will, of rejecting God as the source of knowledge. It leads to the worship of idols, according to verse 12. The people are denied the access to God. They've rejected God. God's rejected them. So they go and ask wooden idols. The phrase here is that they ask of trees. That's the way it's phrased in the Hebrew. The implication here, as it is in a similar passage in Jeremiah chapter 10, verses 3 through 4, where it says, for the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of hands of the workmen with the axe. They deck it with silver and with gold, and they fasten it with nails and hammers, that it move not. When the people of Israel were separated, when they were separated or taken away from God, they turned to false worship for their answers to life's questions. Before they left Egypt, the people were warned not to seek answers from the gods of the nations. They were told in Deuteronomy 18, 9 through 12, when thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. There shall be none found among you, anyone that maketh his son or daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or the observer of times, or the enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all these things are an abomination unto the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord doth drive them out from before thee. In our postmodern times in which we live, you will notice this. America has, for the most part, rejected God as the source of their knowledge. Now, I know there are those that would like to go back and say, well, we were founded upon Christian principles that would like to go back there. But we're not going back there. We haven't, and we aren't going to. We can't crank back the clock 200 or 300 years. It's not going to happen. America has decided, for the most part, that the evolutionary answer is true. America has, for the most part, determined that the Bible is mere legend or fiction or myth. That it might be good literature, so they teach it as literature in college. But it is not the source for knowledge. America has, for the most part, rejected it. And that was during the modernist period. Now we're postmodernists. So what postmodernists have decided is that not only does the knowledge of God not benefit you, but then the knowledge of science doesn't either. Okay? So, a common phrase among people when you tell them things in this world is, well, whatever. That's a postmodernist response. Who cares? Whatever. We have rejected the God and the Bible as the knowledge, as the source of truth and knowledge. As a result, there has been an increase in nature worship. Palm readers, psychics. We've also seen an increase in idol worship in our land. People from other countries who were involved in idol worship have taken and immigrated here. Or they've gone and lived in another country and they brought their idol that they learned about there back home with them. Okay. So, one of the biggest buildings I see And that's not necessarily idol worship, but it's worship of another god. One of the biggest buildings I see back and forth on my way to work, depending on which highway I take, is a large mosque. Okay? It's not the First Baptist Church up there on 820. It's a large mosque out there on 114. And we have a lot of people of the Indian culture. They have various gods that they worship, and they brought those gods with them. So in America, we have seen the increase of idol worship. Okay? But not only idols, we have these other things, these psychic friends networks and these other magic things. Now you can see it when you go down to half-price books. How many of you go down to half-price books? I go down to half-price books a lot. I love half-price books. The books aren't exactly half-price, but hey, that's okay. All right, so I go into half-price books. I go to the religion aisle. I'm looking for some reference material because I never have enough material to preach sermons from, so I go buy more books. But I go to that religious section, and I go to the Christian Bible section, and there's an aisle there. Now the next aisle over is the occult section. And guess what? It has more books on it than the Christian section. So if you don't, and by the way, there's usually more people when I go there in the occult section than in the Christian book section. So you don't think that kind of worship's increased in our society? You better believe it has. And why has it increased? Is because we as a people have rejected the knowledge that God has provided, so we're seeking knowledge from some other source. Oh, by the way, while you're on that Christian aisle, if you look, it's kind of set into that Christian aisle. It's really set into two sections, and one of those is Christian fiction. So you're not even getting real discussion about the Scripture in about half those books in the first place. And some of them are written by cultists. I noticed that the Mormon books are over there, and the Jehovah's Witnesses books are on the same shelf with the Christians. So if you think about it, you got the whole occult section. Yeah, you have the Christian section, and they're almost the same size, but about half of that Christian section you could take and throw into the dumpster and not lose any knowledge about God. Then you could take that section that's left of the Christian books, and you could call out all the Jehovah's Witnesses books and the Mormon books and the other cults and throw them away, and that half isn't even half a shelf anymore. It isn't even a half of an aisle. So believe me, the rejection of the knowledge of God is and does lead to false worship. Now, because of the world's many religions and Christians being spread across the world, we sometimes have now incorporated the ideas and holidays and other things of these false religions into Christian practice. Remember I told you that in Samaria they put these golden calves earlier today. I told you they put these golden calves in the temple up in Samaria, and they call them Jehovah. So I will tell you that not everything that says the name of the Lord is of the Lord or scriptural. Okay? Just because they use the right words and phrases. Now the second result here is that there becomes in this false worship a dependence on divination. The next phrase says, this next phrase in the passage, other than the one we just dealt with, says, and their staffs declare them. Now this is an ancient cultic practice. I would hold up 2 sheepherder's staffs in my hand, and I would either toss them up in the ground or throw them on the ground, and they would fall in a certain pattern. Okay? And I would determine what I was going to do next week or the answer to my life's question by looking at how these 2 staffs fell on the ground. Now we smile and snicker at that, but there might be some of that going on in today's world too. How many of you have been to a novelty shop? I've been to a novelty shop. Right? They have little knickknacks and things. And inside that novelty shop, there's this big black ball sitting on the shelf with an 8 on it. It's an 8 ball, right? And what happens when you turn the 8 ball over? So what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to ask it a question, shake the 8 ball, turn the 8 ball over, and it gives you an answer. Right? Well, if there wasn't some attraction to that, we wouldn't be buying those and putting them in our house. All right? But that's not the only thing. There are people who determine their future by shaking a few dice and throwing them out and seeing what the number is. We seem to take the laying the fleece out that Gideon did. And did get an answer from the Lord from that. And we take it to an extreme. If the next song I hear on the radio is, I'm going to do X. Right? If that preacher says Y, then I know that what I've been thinking about is spiritual. Whatever it may be, we use these physical means to determine stuff. The flipping of a coin. It may be a great choice for determining which team gets to kick off and the other gets to receive, but it's not a great tool for determining life's questions.
Denied the access to communication and the knowledge from God, we will turn to other things. Both the turning to idol worship and the use of divination is seen by God as spiritual whoredom. We see this in verse 12 and again in verses 14 through 19. Now, the next major point in this passage is that people who've turned away from the knowledge of God have a dependence on location. They're seeking for that mountaintop experiences, or they worship in groves. According to Kyle and Dillich, mountaintops and hills were favorite places for idolatrous people or idolatrous worship because men thought that they were close to heaven and to deity. Green, shady trees in the plains and the valleys were also chosen for this purpose. The worship of the nature goddess took place in sacred groves. This practice continued even after biblical times. The goddess, whether it's Diana or someone else, the goddess was tied to nature. Her tie to nature had to do with her fertility, and her fertility had to do with sex. Now, this dependence on location, let's break that down a little bit. The rejection of God leads to nature worship. In today's world, we want to be green. And as everyone who has ever watched Kermit the Frog knows, it's not easy being green. Today's society promotes Mother Nature, getting back to nature, etc. In the late 1970s, I was a member of the Sierra Club. I enjoyed hiking. I enjoyed going into the mountains and finding some new place I'd never been. I went on many day hikes with the club. I enjoyed it very much. In the early 1980s, in reaction to the Reagan administration, the club got more into politics. Every meeting turned more toward environmental concerns and were directed at anti-Reaganism. I quit. We seem driven by nature worship with global warming looming over our heads. Now, I'm not saying we should not be good stewards of our environment, but it seems as though we are going natural. And it's taken over our world. And for some, it has taken the form of nature worship. Now, also, the rejection of God leads to place worship. This morning, when someone asks you, where are you going or what are you doing? And you said, I'm going to church. What exactly did you mean? The building where we attend? Do you think the place where we worship? Do you think of it as the sanctuary? Haven't you seen major ministries advocating some cruise, telling you, come with us on this cruise for this spiritual experience? They might call it a spiritual journey. I know of some people who find a spiritual element in going through corn mazes or hedge mazes. I think we can all think of a time when we've gone to the mountains or maybe even carved out a special place in our home, decorated it with candles or something else. And that was our place for God. I know of places that are called sacred. I know of a place that's called a sacred grove in America. People have designated it because they thought they had some spiritual experience there, or maybe their spiritual leader had an experience there. Now, the rejection of God also leads to sex. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this topic too long. Sex has a strong emotional element to it, and many have strong emotional responses to it. And some would equate that feeling with a spiritual experience. Since the 1960s, the emphasis on our society has been wrapped up in the sexual revolution and in the free love movement. It explodes in front of us each day on TV, movies, and in music. Some forms of nature worship are based in sex. Some are based in the idea of the nature goddess. Now, let's look at some applications. Bottom line, this passage has been about the rejection of God as our source for knowledge. The second point of emphasis is that when you reject God, you will turn to other forms of worship and other objects to worship. Lastly, this sermon notes that the rejection of God is as a source of knowledge and the object of worship leads to spiritual and physical whoredom in the eyes of God. What can you do about that? Well, number one, look at what you have in your life that you absolutely must have. My mother used to have a porcelain statue of an Asian wise man. We had spent some time in the Far East. I am not saying that it was an object of worship for my mother, but it had become overly important to her. I think it may be classified as a household god. Now remember Rachel, Jacob's wife, a member of the family of promise, stole her father's household gods and hid them away. Find out what is important to you. What is more important to you than your relationship with God, and get rid of it. Number two, there was a book written by A.H. Lewis, a famous SDB writer, called Paganism Remaining in Christianity. His book is based mainly in ancient water worship and its remaining influence in Christianity. H. Lewis, however, notes also other false worship practices that have found their way into Christianity. He points to the pagan high days such as Lent, Christmas, and Easter. He shows how their origin as days of worship go back to a time before Christianity. There are other books like Two Babylons by Hislop that show the influence of paganism on the Catholic Church, and therefore also upon the churches closely associated with it. By the way, the SDBs, nor did most Baptists, or for that matter, Protestants, keep Christmas as we know it today until after the Civil War and the increase of international missions. I am not bashing a particular practice. What I'm doing here is advocating listening knowledge God has given you about proper practice and worship based solely in Scripture. Look in your lives and find out how to worship and how your worship has been tainted by the outside influences, and get rid of it. Now, number 3, stay away from place worship. The church is a called out assembly of believers. Get rid of worship zones. There aren't any places closer to God than you are. Don't go to the mountains to find yourself. Don't go to the forest to contemplate about God. You can do that right here and now. Search out the special sacred groves in your life and cut them down. Number 4, stay away from the astrology page in the paper and Madam So-and-so and the Sacred Friends Network, or whatever form of folk magic that supplies you with knowledge. Don't be like Saul when you feel that God is not giving you knowledge, you don't need to consult a witch. Number 5, what compromises have you made in your moral character to go along and get along? Stop doing it. Now, number 6, sometimes we just need to extract ourselves from the world of nature worship and the culture of sex in our society. Sometimes we need to turn off the TV, pass by the tabloid and other media, and turn off the radio, the computer, and the other broadcasters of the messages of filth and debauchery. In conclusion, this week the passage was really all about the rejection of God as the source of truth and knowledge, and the replacement of Him with something else. We just discussed possible applications of the passage. All of these applications are based in the rejection of God as your source of knowledge. They are all dealing with the symptom of areas of our lives that we either haven't turned over to God or that we have turned back from God. Bottom line, the real solution to the problem is to study the Word of God, accepted in our hearts and minds as our only rule of faith and practice, and then apply what we've learned.